Once, the most respected scholar in Nishapur did something no one expected. He gave away his legendary library, sold his luxurious house, and moved into a pauper's cell. Colleagues said he had lost his mind. Students felt betrayed. But Abu Bakr knew. He had spent 30 years studying the map of the path to God, and only now understood that he had never taken a single step along that path. In the city of Nishapur, in the year 457 of the Hijra, there lived a scholar named Abu Bakr al-Kasani, and there was no one in that city, or indeed in all of Khorasan, more learned, more versed in religious sciences than he. He knew the entire Quran by heart, with 7 modes of recitation, remembered 20,000 hadiths with complete chains of transmission, could quote verbatim the works of Al-Ghazali, Ash-Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, and hundreds of other scholars. His library contained more than 3,000 manuscripts, some so rare that kings offered entire fortunes for them. Students came to him from Baghdad, Cairo, Samarkand, to study at his feet, record his lectures, receive ijazah permission to transmit knowledge in his name. He prevailed in debates with philosophers, Mutazilites, representatives of other schools of jurisprudence. His logic was impeccable, his arguments irrefutable, his knowledge of texts so profound that opponents surrendered, unable to withstand the torrent of proof he unleashed upon them. But there was one strangeness in Abu Bakr's life that no one knew about, which he hid even from his closest students. Every night, after he finished the final prayer, Aisha and the students dispersed to their rooms. He locked himself in his study and sat at the table piled with books. He would open a volume of the Quran, begin reading, and within minutes feel a strange emptiness that spread inside him, filling all the space from chest to throat. The words were familiar to the smallest detail. He could explain the grammar of every sentence, the history of the revelation of every surah, the disagreements of scholars regarding the interpretation of every ayah. But the words did not touch his heart, evoked no response, slipped through consciousness like water through fingers, leaving no trace. He read about paradise and felt no desire to reach it. He read about hell and felt no fear. He read about the majesty of Allah and felt no awe. There was only knowledge-cold, precise, dead knowledge that lay in his head like books on shelves, useful, correct, but devoid of life. Abu Bakr tried to pray with greater fervor, lengthened his rakats, recited additional surahs, performed night vigils. But the result was the same. Prayer was mechanical, movements correct, but the soul remained somewhere aside, observing from the outside as the body performed prescribed rituals. He made dua, asked Allah for various things, for health, for knowledge, for blessing upon his students, but the words seemed empty, as if he were speaking them into a void, not believing that anyone was listening, that anyone would answer. Sometimes, in moments of particular longing, he remembered his childhood, when he was just beginning to learn, when every new ayah was a discovery, every hadith evoked trembling. Back then, religion was alive, filled with meaning, and he felt the presence of the Most High in every moment of his life. But years of study, thousands of books read, endless debates and lectures had transformed religion from a living experience into a set of rules, from a relationship with the Creator into an intellectual exercise. One morning, as Abu Bakr was walking to the mosque for dawn prayer, he saw something that shook him to the depths of his soul. On the steps of the mosque sat a beggar, an old man in torn clothing, blind, with an outstretched hand begging for alms. Abu Bakr had seen him many times before, always gave him a coin without thinking, fulfilling the prescription to give charity. But this morning, something made him stop and look closer. The beggar was weeping, tears flowing down his wrinkled face, his lips barely moving, pronouncing something inaudible. Abu Bakr approached closer and heard that the old man was repeating the same word again and again with such passion, such pain and love in his voice that the scholar froze in place. The word was simple, one of the 99 names of Allah, Al-Wadud, the loving. The old man repeated this name like a mantra, like a prayer, like a cry of the soul, and in his voice was such sincerity, such deep connection with the one he addressed, that Abu Bakr felt a stab of envy, sharp and unexpected. This illiterate beggar, who could not read a single ayah, who did not know a single hadith, had what the great scholar lacked, had a living connection with the Creator, had love that overwhelmed him despite blindness, poverty, and suffering. After that encounter, Abu Bakr could find no peace. He tried to continue his usual life-giving lectures, conducting debates, writing commentaries on sacred texts. But everything seemed meaningless, a waste of time. He looked at his students, saw how diligently they recorded his words, memorized chains of transmission, learned by heart the opinions of different scholars on various questions, and understood that he was making them just like himself. People with heads full of knowledge but with empty hearts, people who knew everything about God but did not know God himself. He began asking himself questions that previously seemed foolish to him, unworthy of a serious scholar. What was all this knowledge for if it did not bring one closer to the Most High? Why remember 20,000 hadiths if the heart remained hardened? Why win debates if victory brought neither joy nor peace? Why pray 5 times a day if prayer did not fill the soul with light, did not give a sense of closeness to the Creator? He tried to find answers in books, in the works of Sufi sheikhs who wrote about the spiritual path, about love for Allah, about states of the heart. He read Al-Ghazali, who himself had gone through a crisis, left teaching, and withdrew into seclusion to find true faith. He read Rabia al-Adawiyya, the great Sufi saint, who said she worshipped Allah not from fear of hell, nor from desire for paradise, but from pure love for Him. He read Ibn Arabi, Al-Junayd, Al-Hallaj, all the great masters of the spiritual path, and in their words found descriptions of what he so lacked. Descriptions of living faith, burning love, direct experience of divine presence. But reading did not help, because it was all the same thing, more knowledge, more concepts, more words that remained words, not transforming into experience. Abu Bakr began increasingly to leave the city, wander through the surroundings, seek solitude, hoping that silence would help him hear what he could not hear in the noise of the city, among books and students. He climbed the hills around Nishapur, sat on stones, and looked at the valley below, at the city with its mosques and madrasas, at the roads along which caravans traveled, and tried to pray, tried to find words that would express what he felt. But words would not come, or came wrong-learned formulas that he had repeated thousands of times, but which expressed nothing living, nothing real. He felt like a fraud, a man who had spent his entire life teaching others religion, but himself did not know what religion was in its true sense, did not know what it meant to love God, trust Him, feel His presence in every moment of life. One day, during one of these walks, when Abu Bakr had wandered farther than usual into hilly terrain where sheep grazed, he saw a shepherd. This was a young man, about 25 years old, in simple clothing with a staff in hand, sitting on a hillside watching his flock. Something in his posture and the expression on his face attracted the scholar's attention, and he stopped, observing from a distance. The shepherd sat motionless, his lips barely perceptibly moving, and on his face was an expression of such peace, such deep tranquility, that Abu Bakr felt a strange excitement. He approached closer, greeted him, and the shepherd turned to him, smiled with a simple, open smile, and returned the greeting. The scholar asked if he could sit beside him, and the shepherd nodded, indicating a place next to himself. They sat in silence for some time, and Abu Bakr felt that from this simple man emanated some special calm, some inner strength that was absent in all the educated people with whom the scholar communicated every day. Finally, he could not restrain himself and asked the shepherd what he had been thinking about as he sat here so quietly, what words he had been pronouncing. The shepherd looked at him with surprise, as if the question were strange, and answered simply that he had been talking with Allah, telling him about his day, thanking him for the sun, for the sheep, for the grass under his feet, asking for protection for his family, sharing his thoughts as one shares with a close friend. Abu Bakr asked whether the shepherd knew any du'as, proper prayer formulas taught in the mosque, and the shepherd shook his head, said he could not read, did not know Arabic, knew only a few surahs his mother had taught him when he was a child, and those he remembered poorly, with mistakes. But this was not important, he added, because Allah hears the heart, not the words. He understands even what is not spoken aloud. He is closer to a person than the jugular vein, as it says in the sacred book, and therefore one can speak with him simply, honestly, without beautiful formulations. Abu Bakr sat beside the shepherd and felt how something inside him was turning over, how everything he believed in, the entire system of knowledge he had so carefully constructed over the years, was beginning to crack at the seams. This illiterate youth, who could not correctly recite even a short surah, who made mistakes in pronunciation, who did not know a single hadith, had what the great scholar lacked, had simplicity and sincerity in relations with the Creator, had love that did not need confirmation by texts, justification by logic, approval by scholars. He simply loved Allah as naturally as he breathed, as he looked at the sun, as he rejoiced in a new day. And this love filled his life with meaning, gave him the peace that all the books in the world could not give. The scholar asked the shepherd whether he wanted to learn to read the Quran correctly, whether he wanted to know more about religion, about laws, about how to perform prayer correctly, how to do ablution correctly, about all those subtleties that a Muslim must know. The shepherd thought, then answered that, of course, it would be good to know more, but he was afraid that knowledge might overshadow the main thing for him, might turn living relations with the Creator into a set of rules, might make him worry about form, forgetting content. He had seen people who knew religion well, who prayed correctly, fasted, went to the mosque, but in their eyes there was no light, in their words there was no warmth. They performed rituals, but it seemed they did it out of obligation, without joy, without love. He did not want to become like that. He preferred to remain simple and illiterate, but preserve this connection, which was dearer to him than anything. These words struck Abu Bakr like a lightning bolt. He understood that the shepherd had described precisely him, the great scholar, who knew everything about religion but had lost religion itself, who could discourse for hours about love for Allah, quote ayahs and hadiths on this topic, but himself did not feel this love, did not know what it was. He had spent his entire life studying a map, thinking that studying the map was the journey itself, that knowledge of water would quench thirst, that description of food would feed the hungry. He had become an expert on the spiritual path, but himself had not taken a single step along this path, remained standing at the beginning, examining signposts, reading instructions, discussing with others where the road leads, but not daring to walk along it. Abu Bakr stayed with the shepherd until sunset. They sat on the hill, watched the sun descend beyond the horizon, painting the sky in pink and golden tones, and the shepherd spoke, simply artlessly, about how he saw the presence of Allah in everything around him, in every cloud, in every blade of grass, in every breath of wind. He said that when he looked at the sunset, he saw not just a beautiful picture, but a sign, a reminder of the Creator's greatness, of His generosity, of the fact that He gave people this beauty simply, not demanding anything in return, only that they rejoice, give thanks, remember Him. He said that when he held a newborn lamb in his hands, he felt the miracle of creation, understood that every living being is proof of the Creator's existence, that it is impossible to look at the perfection of this tiny creature and not believe that someone wise and loving created it. He said that when he saw his sheep find water in desert terrain, how they instinctively knew where to seek food, how they cared for their lambs, he understood that Allah guides every creature, cares for each one, and if He cares for animals, then how much more He cares for people, whom He created in His image, to whom He gave reason and soul. The scholar listened to these simple words and felt how something inside him was beginning to melt, how the ice that had lain on his heart for long years was beginning to crack, letting in light. He understood that all this time he had been seeking Allah in the wrong place, seeking Him in books, in the words of scholars, in complex philosophical concepts, whereas He was nearby, in every moment, in every breath, in every heartbeat. One simply needed to open one's eyes, cleanse the heart of pride and knowledge, of self-satisfaction with learning, of the illusion that understanding texts is understanding God. When the time came for evening prayer, Maghrib, the shepherd stood up, performed ablution with water from a small spring nearby, and began praying right there, on the hillside, under the open sky. His prayer was incorrect from the standpoint of fiqh. He made mistakes in positions, confused the order of some movements, pronounced surahs with errors in pronunciation. But on his face was such an expression of reverence, such concentration, such love, that Abu Bakr, observing from the side, felt tears filling his eyes. This incorrect prayer of the simple shepherd was more accepted by Allah than thousands of impeccable prayers of the scholar, because it came from a pure heart, from a soul that sincerely reached toward the Creator, not caring about form, thinking only of the one before whom it stood. Abu Bakr returned to the city late at night, passed by his house straight to the mosque, found a quiet corner, and for the first time in many years tried to pray not out of habit, not mechanically counting rakats, but as the shepherd prayed, with an open heart, with sincere desire to unite with the Most High. He began reciting the Fatiha, the first surah of the Quran, which he had known by heart since childhood, which he had read thousands, tens of thousands of times in his life, but now read as if for the first time, listening to every word, trying to feel the meaning, not just pronounce correct sounds. Bismillahir-Rahman-ir-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. He stopped on these words, and for the first time in long years, they meant something to him, were not just a formula that needed to be pronounced before beginning recitation, but were a reminder that the one to whom he addressed was compassionate and merciful, that one could come to him with one's weakness, with one's emptiness, with one's pain, and he would accept, would not turn away, would not judge. He continued praying, and with every word felt how something inside was changing, how the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crumble. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, praise be to Allah, Lord of the worlds. He thought about these words, about what it means to be Lord of the worlds, about the greatness of the Creator who holds in his hands all that exists, from the tiniest atom to enormous galaxies, and yet finds time to hear the prayer of a simple shepherd on a hill, to notice a tear on the cheek of a blind beggar on the mosque steps, to know about every thought in the head of a scholar lost in his pride. Ar-Rahman Ir-Rahim, the compassionate, the merciful, again these words. Repetition, emphasizing that mercy is not an accidental quality of the Most High, but His essence, that which defines His relation to creatures, that which makes possible forgiveness, repentance, return to the right path after straying from it. Abu Bakr finished the prayer and sat, leaning his back against the mosque wall, and wept as he had not wept since childhood. Tears flowed down his face, dripped onto his clothing, and he did not try to stop them, was not ashamed, did not think about what people would think if they saw the great scholar sobbing in a corner of the mosque in the middle of the night. He wept from relief, from realization that finally, after so many years of wandering, he had found what he was seeking, not in books, not in debates, not in students' praise, but here, in this silence, in this simple act of sincere prayer, in this moment when everything unnecessary fell away and only the naked truth remained. I and you, slave and Lord, creation and creator, without intermediaries, without interpretations, without scholarly opinions, simply a relationship, living real, filled with love. The following days were strange for all who knew Abu Bakr. The great scholar canceled all his lectures, stopped receiving students, did not respond to invitations to participate in debates. He spent days in the mosque or wandered through the city's surroundings, sat on hills, looked at the sky, at clouds, at birds, and people who saw him wondered what had happened to the man who had always been so busy, so important, so immersed in his scholarly works. Students tried to find out what had happened, whether their teacher had fallen ill, whether something bad had occurred. But Abu Bakr waved away their questions, said everything was fine, that he simply needed time to think, reconsider some things. They did not understand that their teacher was going through a transformation, through the death of his old self and the birth of a new one, that he was learning anew what children are taught in the first days of their religious education, learning to love God, trust Him, see His presence in the world. Abu Bakr returned several times to that hill where he had met the shepherd, hoping to see him again, talk, ask questions that swarmed in his head. But the shepherd was not there. The flock had gone to other pastures, and the scholar understood that perhaps he would never meet that youth again, that that meeting had been a gift, a sign from the Most High, who had sent him a teacher in the most unexpected guise. Not in the form of a famous sheikh with a long beard and a string of disciples, but in the form of a simple shepherd who could not read but knew the most important thing, knew how to love God. And Abu Bakr thanked Allah for that meeting, understanding that without it he might have spent all his remaining life in his scholarly prison, surrounded by books and students, respected and revered, but internally dead, deprived of the one thing that truly mattered. A month after meeting the shepherd, Abu Bakr summoned his students. About 100 people gathered, The best students of the madrasa, those who had sat at his feet for years, absorbed his knowledge, hoped someday to become as great scholars as their mentor. They came with curiosity and anxiety, not knowing what to expect, frightened by the teacher's strange behavior of late. Abu Bakr stood before them and for the first time in long years did not feel confidence, that unshakable confidence in his knowledge, in his rightness, which had always been his distinguishing feature. He felt like a beginner, a person who was only beginning to understand what religion truly was, and he had to tell the students something that could destroy everything he had taught them. He began speaking slowly, carefully choosing words. He said that his entire life he had taught them the science of religion, transmitted hadiths to them, explained fiqh, analyzed subtleties of aqidah, and all this was correct, all this was necessary, all this was part of their duties as Muslims. But he understood that he had missed the most important thing, that he had given them a map, but not taught them to travel, given them a description of food, but not taught them to eat, told them about love for Allah, but not shown them how to love. He spoke about how knowledge without love is a lamp without fire, which gives neither light nor warmth, that one can know all hadiths by heart and yet have a dead heart, that one can win debates and yet be far from the Most High, that one can perform impeccable prayers and yet not have a real connection with the one to whom one prays. The students listened with astonishment, some with disbelief, some with growing understanding. Abu Bakr told them about the meeting with the shepherd, not naming names, not indicating the place, simply described that simple man who knew almost nothing about religion, but had what the great scholar lacked, had living faith, burning love, direct experience of divine presence. He spoke about how they, the students, risked repeating his mistake, risked becoming just like he had been, people with enormous knowledge but with empty hearts, people who would teach others religion but themselves would not know what religion is in its true essence. He begged them not to forget that the goal of all this knowledge was not simply to know, not to win arguments, not to receive ijazah and become respected scholars, but to draw closer to the Most High, purify their hearts, learn to love Him as He deserves to be loved. Abu Bakr told them that knowledge should be a means, not an end, that every hadith learned should change the heart, not simply supplement memory, that every book read should bring one closer to Allah, not simply make one more erudite. He spoke about how there are many simple people, illiterate, not knowing a single hadith, who are closer to Jannah than scholars with their libraries and dissertations, because these simple people have pure hearts, have sincerity, have love that surpasses all the knowledge in the world. He quoted an ayah of the Quran, where Allah says, He will raise those who believed and those who were given knowledge, but specified that elevation is promised only to those in whom knowledge is united with faith, not to those in whom knowledge exists separately from faith, like cold information stored in the head but not affecting life. Some students wept, hearing his words, recognizing in his description themselves, seeing that same emptiness he described, that same mechanicalness in worship, that same absence of living connection with the Creator. Others looked with incomprehension, could not agree that their teacher, the man they considered exemplary, suddenly declares that all this time he had been wrong, that everything he had taught them was incomplete. Still, others were angry, felt they had been deceived, that they had spent years studying something their teacher now called insufficient. But Abu Bakr did not retreat, continued speaking, knowing that many would not understand, many would condemn, but hoping that at least some would hear, at least some would accept this message and not repeat his mistake. He finished his speech with words that later became famous, that were passed from generation to generation, quoted in books by Sufi sheikhs. He said that he had spent 30 years studying religion, and only now, in his 52nd year of life, was beginning to understand what religion truly was. He said that if he could start over, he would spend less time memorizing hadiths and more on purifying the heart, less on debates with philosophers and more on solitary prayers, less on writing treatises and more on serving the poor, less on demonstrating his learning and more on cultivating humility. He said that knowledge is a gift from Allah, a great gift, but it is a gift that can become a curse if it makes a person proud, if it makes him think he is better than others, that he is closer to God because he knows more. True closeness to Allah is measured not by the quantity of texts learned, but by the state of the heart, its purity, its love, its sincerity. After that meeting with students, Abu Bakr's life changed completely. He did not return to his former activities, did not again give lectures, conduct debates, write scholarly works. Instead, he gave away most of his enormous library, keeping only the most necessary books, the Quran, basic hadith collections, a few works on fiqh. The rest he gave to his students, to madrasas in other cities, to all who wanted to learn. He sold his large house, luxuriously furnished, full of expensive things he had accumulated over years of a successful career, and moved into a small room near the mosque, modest, with minimum furniture, almost a cell. Money from selling the house he gave to the poor, to widows, to orphans, spent on building a well in a poor quarter where people suffered from lack of water. He began spending most of his time serving people, helping the poor, caring for the sick, visiting prisons, where he talked with prisoners, gave them consolation, told them about Allah's mercy, about how it is never too late to repent, that the Most High accepts repentance even from the greatest sinners if it is sincere. He went to the market, helped old merchants carry heavy sacks, bought goods from those who barely made ends meet, overpaying them to support their families. He sat with beggars on mosque steps, shared food with them, listened to their stories, prayed for them. People who had known him before could not believe their eyes, seeing the great scholar, the man with whom viziers and scholars from all over the Islamic world sought meetings, sitting beside a ragged beggar, talking with him as an equal, as a friend. His former colleagues, other scholars of Nishapur, condemned him, said he had lost his mind, that he had committed foolishness, wasting years of study, refusing a position many dreamed of occupying. They said his words about knowledge without love were an insult to all who had devoted their lives to serving science, that he had become a victim of Sufi madness, that dangerous tendency that placed emotions above reason, experience above knowledge, love above law. Some even tried to discredit him, spread rumors that he had fallen into heresy, that his new views contradicted Orthodox Islam, that one should beware of his influence. But Abu Bakr did not respond to criticism, did not enter into disputes, did not try to defend himself. He simply continued living as he considered right, and his life was his answer, more eloquent than any words. Gradually, a new group of students began gathering around him, completely unlike the former. These were not ambitious students striving to become great scholars, but simple people, artisans, merchants, peasants, who came to him not for knowledge of hadiths and fiqh, but for something else, for that spiritual guidance he could now give, having learned from the shepherd on the hill. He taught them to pray with the heart, not simply perform movements, taught them to see Allah in everything around them, in nature, in people, in events of their lives, taught them to trust the Most High Accept trials as signs of his love. Rejoice in blessings as manifestations of his generosity. He told them not about complex questions of theology, not about disagreements of scholars, but about simple things, about how to be kind, how to forgive offenses, how to love people for Allah's sake, how to find Him in everything. 5 years passed. Abu Bakr aged, his hair turned completely gray, his back bent, but in his eyes appeared a light that had not been there before, the light of inner peace, deep satisfaction. He no longer felt that emptiness that had tormented him for years, no longer performed mechanical prayers, no longer read the Quran without understanding. Every prayer was a living meeting with the Creator. Every ayah of the Quran opened new meanings. Every day was filled with a sense of divine presence. He understood that he had lost 30 years of his life wandering in a labyrinth of knowledge, but he had found what he was seeking, and the remaining years were fuller, richer, more meaningful than all the previous decades. One day, he received a letter from a distant city, from one of his former students who had become a famous scholar, taught at a large madrasa, had hundreds of students. The student wrote that 5 years had passed since that memorable meeting when the teacher spoke about knowledge and love, and all this time he had been reflecting on those words, trying to understand what Abu Bakr had meant. At first, he was angry, felt betrayed, thought the teacher had renounced everything he had taught them. But gradually, continuing his own scholarly career, he began noticing that same emptiness the teacher had spoken of, that same mechanicalness in worship, that same absence of living connection with Allah. And now, he understood. He finally understood what Abu Bakr had meant and asked forgiveness for his previous thoughts, thanked him for the lesson, which was the most important of all lessons he had ever received. Abu Bakr read this letter and wept from joy, from gratitude to the Most High that at least one person understood, at least one soul heard that message which had been so difficult for him to convey. He answered the letter, a short, simple letter, in which he wrote that he should not teach anyone, that he himself was still learning, still a beginner on the spiritual path, that the true teacher had been that nameless shepherd on the hill whom he had met once and never saw again, but whose lesson changed his entire life. He wrote that each person must find his own shepherd, his own guide, who will show him the path from head to heart, from knowledge to love, from religion as a system of rules to religion as a living relationship with the Creator. Abu Bakr died at the age of 63, quietly, in his small room near the mosque, surrounded by a few close students. His last words were the Shahada, the testimony of faith, pronounced with such love, such joy, that those present said afterward that they had never seen a person dying with such a smile on his face, with such light in his eyes. At his funeral, there were no viziers or famous scholars, no pompous speeches about his contribution to science, no long enumerations of his works and achievements. There were simple people, hundreds of simple people. The poor he had helped, the sick he had visited, the prisoners to whom he had given hope, those he had taught to love Allah, trust Him, see Him in everything. They carried his body in their arms, wept and prayed for him, and each felt they had lost not simply a teacher, but a friend, a brother, a man who had shown them that religion is not a burden, not a set of prohibitions and obligations, but a path to joy, to peace, to that love which fills life with meaning. Years later, his story became legend. They told of the great scholar who knew 20,000 hadiths, but found faith only after meeting an illiterate shepherd. They told how he renounced glory and wealth to serve the poor. They told of his words that knowledge without love is a lamp without fire, words that became a popular phrase, quoted in sermons, in books, in scholars' conversations about the nature of true knowledge. Some criticized him, said he had diminished the significance of science, that his path was a deviation from proper Islam. Others revered him as a saint, as a man who had traveled the path from head to heart and shown others this path. But all agreed on one thing. Abu Bakr al-Qassani was a man who had the courage to change his life at 50, admit he had been wrong, renounce everything he had in the name of what he considered truth. And somewhere in the hills around Nishapur, as old men told it, a flock still grazes, and the shepherd guarding it sometimes sits on a slope, watches the sunset, and talks with Allah in simple words, not knowing that once his unwitting lesson changed the life of a great scholar, and through him the lives of hundreds, thousands of other people who heard the story of how true closeness to God is measured not by the quantity of texts learned, but by the depth of love in the heart. That one can be illiterate and holy, one can be a scholar and lost, and that the only knowledge that truly matters is knowledge of how to love the one who created us, gave us life, and waits for us to finally open our hearts and allow him to enter.